right, thanks for joining us. We're going to cover the end of chapter 14 of Matthew and begin chapter 15. And what we want to look at today, we're going to go ahead and start reading in chapter 15, and then we'll go back and pick up a little bit of 14 and kind of see how it fits in. But what we want to start with is chapter 15, verse 1, and we're going to start with Jesus once again having a conflict with the Pharisees and the scribes. And it says, the Pharisees and the scribes, in verse 1, came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." He answered them, "And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God commanded, 'Honor your father and mother,' and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, 'What you would have gained from me is given to God,' he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" Now, Jesus here is having, once again, a conflict with the religious leaders. And to understand the nature of that conflict, we actually have to go back into chapter 14 and pick up this little piece that goes from verse 34 to 36. So remember that Jesus was in the boat with the disciples, and it says when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. So what happens here is that, remember from last time, we talked about this issue of the covenant relationship with God, with Jesus Christ, and this issue of walking or walking on the water for Peter was the example, but this issue of putting total faith and trust in someone as what is necessary for true life in a covenant. You can't live in covenant unity with somebody while you don't trust them. You have to be 100% for them. They have to be 100% for you. But in order for you to be 100% for them, you have to really trust that they are for you. Otherwise, it's kind of a suicide mission, right? If you give everything over to somebody who's not given everything over for you, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. And so we naturally try to protect ourselves. And we saw last time that this issue of Jesus walking on the water and Peter getting out of the boat was related to those things. Now, what's happened here is that when they cross over, then there's an immediate reaction from the people on the other side of the shore, and that is that they put their faith and trust in Jesus. They trust that he can heal them. And so just as Peter was putting his life on the line and struggled in that, so these people are saying, we're putting our health, we're putting our lives in your hands, Jesus, you can heal. We know that you can heal. And really what you put your trust in is the thing that you have united yourself to covenantally. And that's why faith is such a huge issue throughout Scripture. Whatever you've put your faith in, whatever you put your ultimate trust in, that's the thing that you've united yourself with. And so what you see in life is that people put their faith and trust in a lot of different things. Some people put their faith in wealth and money. Some people put their faith in charm and the ability to be popular. Other people put their faith in themselves or their own ability to get through life. Others don't really trust in anything. And the problem is that what you end up uniting yourself to, you end up sharing that thing's fate. When Jesus talks about the fact that if we are united to him, if we share in his death and his burial, we'll also share in his resurrection and his life, and that's what's symbolized in baptism, then the fact that we share in the sufferings of Christ means we'll share in the glory of Christ, because that's what happens when you unite yourself covenantally to somebody. Their fate is your fate, and yours is theirs. And that's why Jesus went to the cross, because he was making a covenant with us, and he was showing us that he was willing to share our fate so that we could share his. These people here are trusting in Jesus, and so they are they're putting their trust in him. And the Pharisees and scribes are wise enough to understand that this is a huge problem for them. That if the people are trusting in Jesus, then that's going to end up meaning a world of hurt for them at some point in the future. And so that's the context of this situation that develops in chapter 15. This conflict is about the fact that these people are coming to Jesus and putting their faith in him. So the Pharisees and the scribes come to Jesus from Jerusalem and they ask, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands when they eat?" So the question here is, why do the Pharisees and the Sadducees, why do they come to Jesus, and why is this an effective attack in their minds? Most of us would look at this and say, why are you even asking this question? It really doesn't make any sense to us. And, if imagine a politician was running for office and somebody says, "Hey man, I've got the dirt on you. You don't wash your hands before you eat." We wouldn't exactly see that as an effective attack. We would probably, if we were putting our faith in that politician, we would probably continue to put our faith in that politician. It wouldn't change that. So in the minds of the Pharisees, why is this important? Well, it's important because in the Jewish mindset, in the Jewish world, you are either in a covenant with God or you're not in a covenant with God. And this actually gets back to exactly what we were talking about at the end of chapter 14 with Jesus walking on the water. If you recall, before Jesus does that, he sends the disciples ahead so that he can go up on the mountain and pray with God. And we talked about that Jesus is expressing in that moment, that prayer, that Jesus is expressing a unity with God. Well, what the Pharisees are trying to do is they're trying to show that Jesus does not have a covenant relationship with God. They're trying to show that Jesus is actually not from God. He's actually from Satan. They've accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Satan, and they're continuing on that line of attack, and they're trying to say, look, your power, your influence, your ministry, what you're doing with people, your kingdom that you're trying to build and grow, it has nothing to do with union with God. It has everything to do with union with Satan. Now, why is this an effective form of attack? Well, if they can make the charge stick, then people who are Jewish people are not going to want to have anything to do with Jesus. There's a lot of national pride and national identity wrapped up in being the people that have a covenant relationship with God. And how is that covenant relationship, how does that manifest itself in the Old Testament times, under the Old Covenant? How does that manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself with God saying, here's what you should do in the commandments, and the people then trusting in God enough to carry that out. That's the way that this manifests itself. So here's the thing that's important to understand is that obedience to God shows trust in God, and trust in God is the foundation of unity with God. You can't be in a covenant relationship with God and have complete trust in him, and then every time he asks you to do something, say, no, I don't think that's good for me. I don't think that would be the best move for me. If you do that, then clearly you think that God is not for you 100%, and obviously you're not giving 100% because you're holding back your obedience. That's the way that the covenant works, is that he gives everything and you give everything. He's giving everything to you, and the commandments are actually the manifestation of him giving everything to you. And your obedience is the manifestation of you giving everything to him. And so if the religious leaders think that if they can find this place where Jesus is not being obedient to God, then they can break this idea that Jesus and the Father are one, and they can really destroy him in the eyes of the people. So Jesus doesn't answer the question. Now, the question is, why do they not wash their hands before they eat? Now, washing was an important aspect of ceremonial law. And if you were a priest, before you went into the tabernacle, before you did that, you would pass by the brazen altar, and then you would pass by the laver. And as you passed by the laver, you would wash your hands and feet, and then you could go into the holy place, and you could do your ministry of changing the showbread, changing the wine, changing or tending to the lampstand, putting the fire, the oil in there. And also then the coals of the altar of incense had to be tended, and incense had to be put on that altar. All of that stuff you would do, but you would only do that after washing your hands. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that the reason for this is that symbolically you're doing a couple of things. You're washing the blood off your hands, and you're washing the dust off your feet. Now, the dust off your feet is, remember, the ground cries out when Cain kills Abel. Basically the ground cries out. The ground is a witness against us of our distance from God, of our turning our backs on covenant with God, of our walking away from His covenants, His commandments. The ground cries out. And then the other part of that is that our hands have blood on them. They have the life of other people on them. And that's what the ground is testifying to. So both these issues are issues of being unclean and being not being able to walk into the holy place and to have sanctuary access and to be able to be in God's presence, because you can't be in God's presence and not be in God's presence at the same time. This is actually an important thing for us to consider, and it's important to consider because this is actually, as the religious leaders are accusing Jesus of this, what's interestingly happening is that they're actually accusing themselves. They're actually guilty of what they're accusing Jesus of doing. The point being that if you were a Levite, if you were a priest, you could not go into the holy place where God's presence was if you hadn't cleansed yourself of these things. This is actually representative of the idea that if you go into God's presence physically, but emotionally, spiritually, mentally, you are actually not in favor with God. You resent God. You don't trust God. You don't like God. You're against God. You are disobedient to God. Then what happens is that there is a contradiction there that takes place that is destructive to you. This is an important thing to understand, and as Christians, this is really, really important for us to understand, because a lot of us actually walk into the presence of God a lot with hearts that are far from Him, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do. In fact, it's probably the most destructive thing that you can do, because what's going to happen is you're going to grow to resent God, and there's going to be a split that happens within you of trying to make yourself look good, while your heart actually grows farther and farther from Him. Because here's the thing, nothing's worse than having to be obedient to somebody that you don't like, or having to obey laws that you think are not good for you or not helpful to you. You know how it is. We as Americans despise laws that we think are frivolous, that we think are useless, or that we think are harmful to us, and so we grow to despise the people who make those laws. It's exactly the same thing with our relationship with God. That if you don't walk into the presence of God and having been cleansed from your iniquity, then this is going to be a bad time for you, and it's ultimately going to be destructive to you. So what Jesus does is He doesn't really answer the question. Now, you might say to yourself, well, what is washing your hands before you eat? What does that have to do with it? Well, there was a sense in which all of the the Israelites were priests, but there were like priests, and then there were Levite priests, and then there were just Israelite priests. So the point being that in order to go into the tabernacle, you had to actually be a priest. But there was a sense in which all of the Israelites were seen as priests, and so the way that they kind of participated in some of these ceremonial things was that there were oral laws and oral traditions that grew up around, hey, the way you do this is you wash your hands before you eat. Now, the problem here is that Jesus actually doesn't really answer their question, but he does with his own question. He says, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your traditions? So he's saying that these are traditions. You've developed all these traditions. And for God commanded, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, and then he talks about the prophecy of Isaiah. What's happening here is that Jesus is saying, look, you guys are exactly the people that you're accusing us of being. You're the people who walk into the presence of God, but have not cleaned yourselves. You have not cleansed yourselves. You have not been cleansed. And so you walk to the presence of God, and what you do is you alter the actual commands of God by your interpretations of those commands that allow you to get out of this because your hearts aren't with God. If your hearts were with God, you would just do what God said and you would love doing it. But because your hearts aren't with him, then you do the opposite while pretending that you are. And so in doing that, you're growing farther and farther away from God as you draw physically closer and closer to God. As you pretend to get closer, your hearts are getting farther away. And the end of this is going to be destruction. So he says, their heart is far from me. In verse 8, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Verse 9, in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So they're worshiping him in vain because the thing that they're worshiping really isn't God. It's the doctrines that they've created. They're worshiping their own cleverness, their own wisdom, and they're actually disparaging God as they refuse to worship him. So that's the problem that Jesus is dealing with here in chapter 15. So, we should really take this to heart and make sure that our hearts are turned toward God at the same time our body and our lips are. That when we speak well of God, that our hearts are turned toward God as well. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.